Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lord Nelson's blog. My name is Ellen Rankins, and I'm filling in for Lord Nelson today since he sometimes has a little bit of trouble with technology. I'm a PhD student here at Rutgers University, and joining me today, I have Jennifer Weinert-Nelson, also a PhD student. So Jen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Weinert-Nelson. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate here at Rutgers University. I am in the Endocrinology and Animal Biosciences program, which is the graduate program that is affiliated with the Department of Animal Sciences at Rutgers. And I am excited to be here with you today. I am finishing up my PhD program, and I'm excited to share all of the work that I've been doing in the past 5 years. It's really built upon a life of working in the horse industry and agriculture more broadly. I grew up on a dairy farm in rural northern Wisconsin, went to my undergrad at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. And after I completed my undergrad, I actually went out and worked in the horse industry at reining horse trainers in Texas and southern Wisconsin as an assistant horse trainer for several years before I returned to the University of Wisconsin River Falls to manage their campus laboratory farm facilities. While I was there, I got the opportunity to teach both formally as an adjunct and also informally helping professors with their laboratory classes at the lab farm at UWRF. And I really enjoyed that aspect of my job and wanted to be able to pursue it. So I had the opportunity to come to Rutgers to work with Dr. Carrie Williams. And I have had such a great experience here, and I'm excited to share all of that with you today.
Well, thank you, Jen, and we're very excited to have you here. So you've been very busy in your time here at Rutgers and have done lots of exciting research. So can you tell us a little bit about this research you've done?
Yes. So as I mentioned, I work with Dr. Carrie Williams. She's an equine extension specialist for the state of New Jersey. And what that means is that all of the research that we do has to have a practical component. It has to be something that horse owners can apply to better their management of their farms and their care of their horses. And so my research has focused on pasture management strategies that are not only economically and environmentally sustainable, but also promote optimal horse health. Specifically, we've been looking at integrating warm season grasses into traditional cool season rotational grazing systems. Warm season grasses are things like Bermuda grass, teff, crabgrass, bahia grass that are more commonly grown in the southern regions of the United States. However, in the north, we typically grow cool season grasses, which are things like Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue. You might even have a version of these grasses in your lawns at home. And so those grasses grow best under cooler temperatures in the temperate and northern regions of the United States. However, during the hot, dry months of the summer, those cool season grasses do not grow very vigorously. And so the idea behind our research project is that by integrating these warm season grasses that grow best under hot, dry conditions and are acclimated to grow under those conditions into a traditional cool season rotational grazing system, we can take advantage of those complementary growth patterns and bridge that summer slump forage gap when those cool season grasses are semi-dormant. And we wanted to know the impact of this practice not only on pasture production, but also on grazing behavior, metabolism, and the hindgut microbiome of grazing horses.
Okay, thank you for that overview. So in that overview, you mentioned this concept of rotational grazing. So could you maybe explain that concept in a little bit more detail and talk about how the average horse owner might use that practice?
That is a great question. So what you might be most familiar with is just putting horses out in a pasture and letting them eat all the time in one big open pasture area. This is called continuous grazing. It means that horses have continuous access to all areas of the pasture at all times. in rotational grazing, we divide that large pasture area into smaller subsections of pasture. And then we move the horses between those sections based on forage availability. This allows forage to rest and regrow. It also helps to have more to make more even grazing pressure across your pasture sections, and hopefully increases your stand longevity, as well as decreasing, the need for renovations and expenses related to reseeding. And so how you can implement this at home is really, come up with a plan for your pastures. Make an extra fence in the middle of your pasture, or maybe divide it into multiple sections depending on how much area you have and how many horses you have. And you can move your horses between those pastures and help maintain the condition of your pasture forage.
Okay, sounds like some really great advice for all our listeners out there. So I know, because I've been out in the field helping you with some of this research, Jen, that you've gotten to use some pretty cool equipment to answer some of these questions that you had going into this. So can you tell us about some of this different equipment you've used and what you've used it for?
Definitely. One of the coolest pieces of equipment that we've gotten to use in my research is called the EquiWatch system. So the EquiWatch system is a halter that has a pressure sensor built into the noseband, as well as a secondary accelerometer. And the pressure sensor and accelerometer in the noseband can detect chewing in horses. And so it can record and report grazing activity continuously, remotely, over a 24-hour period for long periods of time, in some cases up to a month or longer. And by doing that, we can get a comprehensive look at how the horses are grazing in a full pasture setting without having to have people sitting out there watching them and recording observations, and potentially, those people's presence influencing the grazing activity and grazing behaviors of those horses. And so that equipment is really, really a great addition to our toolbox in investigating grazing behavior and preference of grazing horses for pasture forages. And we did a validation study on that in 2018. So to make sure that those halters could accurately report that data. And then also we did a small pilot study where we looked at horses that were maintained on pasture versus horses that were confined to a dry lot and fed ad libitum hay. We then utilized those halters to compare grazing behavior in horses when they were maintained in the cool season grass sections of our integrated systems versus the warm season grass sections of our integrated systems. And sometimes we paired that with GPS technology. So the GPS technology allows us to know where the horses are located, so we could look at movement as well as grazing activity.
That's pretty cool, Jen. Thanks for sharing with us. So we know this is a lot of work to do all of this research, but did you have a favorite part about working on these projects?
That's a really great question. I think my project had very distinct and separate components. I mentioned it was the pasture production, the grazing behavior, the metabolism, and the hindgut microbiome. And each of those had such great opportunities for me to learn and to develop my skills. And so for me, I think I got something different out of each of them. So it's very hard for me to pick, what was my favorite thing to work on during the project. I will say that the hindgut microbiome to me is fascinating. And so I've really dug into that, especially towards the end of my PhD work. And I'm really excited to continue gaining skills in that area.
You mentioned this word microbiome. I don't know if all of our listeners will be familiar with what the microbiome is and what it does. So could you maybe briefly summarize that for us?
The hindgut microbiome is the gut bugs. So you might be familiar with the term microbiome. It's a big buzzword in animal and human health and nutrition. A microbiome is just the collection of bugs in a given environment. You can have a microbiome on your skin. There can be a microbiome on your desk. And there's definitely a microbiome in your digestive system and a different microbiome across your digestive system. So there's a different microbiome in my mouth versus in my stomach versus in my intestines. In people, we have a digestive system that is not a ton of fiber. We don't have high amounts of fiber in our diet the way that horses or cows do. Cows have a lot of gut bugs in their foregut. So they have fermentation that happens right after they take feed into their mouths, basically. In horses, their gut bugs are concentrated towards the end of their digestive system. They have this large compartment in their large intestine called a cecum, where there are many bacteria that live, and their job is to break down the fiber in the horse's diet, and the byproducts of that fiber fermentation can be absorbed by the horse and used for energy. In fact, something like 50 to 70% of the horse's daily energy requirements comes from the byproducts of fermentation that it absorbs from the hindgut. And so we wanted to know, are there differences in the hindgut microbiome of horses grazing cool versus warm season grasses? How does that microbiome respond when horses are transitioned between cool season grasses and warm season grasses? And what is the relationship between forage nutrients and the hindgut microbiome composition and the byproducts that those hindgut microbes make from their fermentation processes?
Thanks for explaining, Jen. Really appreciate that. So you talked a little bit about some of your favorite parts of the project, but did you have a part that was your least favorite part?
You know, I wanted to just add in here, because when you asked me that about my favorite parts, you know, I talked really about the research and what I liked and learned in each part of the research. But I really should mention that one of my favorite parts about this research and about what I was able to do at Rutgers was all of the undergrads that we were able to bring into this process. So we had a group of, you know, anywhere from 10 to 15 undergrads that helped with all aspects of this project, whether it was collecting samples out in the field or processing samples in the lab or data analysis. They were involved in every piece of it. And that was really a neat opportunity to work with them, to mentor them, and also get them that experience that will help them when they go to, say, apply for vet school or grad school or go out into the real world and get a job. We also had a lot of volunteers that came from local pony clubs and high school research programs. So we were able to really connect with a broad group of students to bring them in to get them experience in research and also help us get our research done. You also then asked about my least favorite part. You know, I think there's going to be downsides to everything, and I tend to focus on the positives wherever I can. I will say the pasture research is challenging because it is, number one, it's seasonal. You have a defined grazing season, and so you only have, you know, several months, set months out of the year to conduct your research, and that can be really challenging. Also, so many things are are environmentally dependent. So how much precipitation do you get? What are your temperature conditions, your humidity conditions? And you have no control over that in your research, and it can really affect your ability to collect samples on the dates that you want to, or, you know, can create some confounding factors for interpreting the results of your research. So definitely one of the biggest challenges in conducting pasture research.
Yes, that sounds like a very big challenge. So I know recently you've been working on kind of putting all of this together and telling a story with it and looking at your results. As you've gone through that process, has there been anything that surprised you that you weren't expecting?
So I think that many of our results were what we expected, although part of the research process is identifying new areas for research. So for example, with our integrated grazing systems, we expected to have greater forage production during that summer slump month by incorporating those warm season grasses into that integrated system versus a regular cool season grass rotational grazing system. And what we did find that we also found that production in late season grazing in the cool season grass sections of the integrated system was a bit lower than in comparison to a regular cool season grass system. And this is likely to do with the proportions of warm season grass to cool season grass on an aerial basis. So how much warm season grass is available for grazing, how much area, and how much area of cool season grass is available. And so, by looking at that, we can say, all right, well, yes, this can work, but we may need to work on changing the proportions of cool season grass area to warm season grass area to make sure that this works best for producers in the real world. One thing that was really surprising, one of the main interests in using warm season grasses for equine grazing, as well as just, even hay source, is that typically warm season grasses are thought to be lower in non-structural carbohydrates, so sugars, starches, fructans, than cool season grasses. And this is generally true across species and across studies. However, what we found was we found minimal differences in our soluble carbohydrates between our warm season grasses and our cool season grasses in this study. And all of our warm season grasses and cool season grasses remain below, a 10% threshold, which has been identified as the threshold that is of concern for horses that may have some sensitivity to non-structural carbohydrate intake from their diet. And so regardless of forage type, we were basically below that threshold of concern. And so the benefit, at least in our management system, for incorporating warm season grasses with regards to limiting NSC content maybe wasn't quite what we had expected, but it's probably informative for the general public because it does demonstrate that perhaps there isn't a big benefit there because the non-structural carbohydrates in the cool season grasses may decline due to the summer heat and dry conditions naturally.
Makes sense. Thanks for sharing. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about research is sometimes we do find out things that we weren't necessarily expecting to find out, or it does raise new questions. So at this point, we're going to kind of wrap up, and I'd like you to, as you think about everything, what are your take-home messages from your research project for the horse owners out there, and how might they incorporate some of these things on their farm?
Well, I think that in terms of the discussion that we just had about the non-structural carbohydrates, because we get this a lot from horse owners. There's a lot of concern about non-structural carbohydrates. And I think the big take-home message is that you really need to test your forage. You need to go out and take pasture samples and send them into a lab so that you know what the nutritional content of that grass is. You can make generalizations based on species that you have or what is known, but until you actually test your grass, you don't know what the nutritional content is. And so you don't have to do that all the time, but if you do it periodically, you learn what is normal for the pasture grasses that you have, for the growing conditions and the management conditions that you have and that you implement on your farm. And so my number one take home is test your pasture grasses so that you know what the nutritional content actually is, so you can make the best decisions possible. In terms of the integrated rotational grazing, I think the take home messages are that this can work. You can utilize warm season grasses to improve your summer production in your horse pastures. If you are in this mid-Atlantic region, it is a viable strategy that you could use. And definitely, if you are interested, you should reach out to your extension agents to get more information about how you might make that work on your farm. There are a number of ways that you can do that. And going back to the microbiome, I think the big takeaway there that people probably are going to have the most question about is the transition between the cool season grass and the warm season grass. Is that going to affect my horse? Am I going to have to worry about my horse's digestive health as they're transitioning between cool season and warm season grasses if I implemented an integrated system? And our data show that really isn't much of a concern. Horses are largely stable across that transition. There is a longer term adaptation to cool versus warm season grasses, but it's a very gradual and subtle process that should not have any negative physiological consequences for your horses.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Jen. It's always a pleasure to chat with you and learn about what's going on. So thanks for taking this time to share with us today.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Ellen. I really appreciate it. And thank Lord Nelson for me when you see him.
I will do so.